Let's tell you about the Justice Department now. It says it will resubmit a request for the extradition of the Gupta brothers from the United Arab Emirates. This follows a meeting between the Minister Ronald Lamola and his counterparts from the UAE. Atul and Rajesh Gupta are wanted on charges of fraud and money laundering. We're now joined by the Department of Justice and Correctional Services Spokesperson Chrispin Phiri. Chrispin, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with a quick reminder of how we got to this point.
So you'd recall that on the 6th of April we announced to the nation that we have finally received communication from the UAE that the court set sometime in February to adjudicate our extradition, and they had found that one of the things that they had seen was that there was a cancelled warrant that was attached to one of the applications. But on the charge of money laundering, they felt that the UAE had the competent authority to prosecute such a crime, so they would deny our request on that basis. And we had felt that this was a technical issue because at the time we had been reassured by the UAE authorities that all of our papers were in order. And we also were very clear that we had submitted a new warrant as well. We had only submitted the cancel warrant just to show that the history of the matter as we were advised by the UAE authorities. So subsequent to that, the Minister of Justice in South Africa and the Minister of the UAE have been in telephone contact at least at some point. But we really felt that a face-to-face meeting with the UAE authorities, with our prosecuting authorities as well, would really take us forward to understand what exactly had gone wrong, but also to address the unnecessary, we believe, communication lags between ourselves and the UAE. Because it's simply unacceptable that a hearing takes place in February and then we only get informed in April about the outcome of the hearing. And although we do accept that the UAE has a closed court system, we do think that the communication could really be better.
Sure. What was the tone of that meeting, and did you come to an understanding what's going to be different this time around?
It was a frank meeting where no holds were held back. Minister Lamola was very clear that this is a matter of major national interest to South Africa. But it's also important for the UAE to be seen as a country that is willing to participate in a rule-based system of the world. And so it's also in their interest as well as a country that they act on these type of requests with integrity and they're able to really show that they are interested in being a rule-based society. And Minister Lamola also expressed his high levels of disappointment in how the matter has been handled, at least by the UAE authorities thus far. The UAE authorities did admit that the communication lags could have been prevented. And in fact, we've got an undertaking from the Minister of Justice that he will really look into what occasioned the unnecessary time delays so that it doesn't happen in the near future. But I think the major outcome from the meeting for us was that both ministers agreed that the prosecuting authorities should look at this jointly as of the 15th of June, which is sometime this month. And they will be able to then relook at resubmitting our extradition request. And also the question of the money laundering charge. A firm decision will be taken as to what happens in the UAE around that. But we did express the fact that we would really prefer that we are able to prosecute this charge because we are advised by the NPA that indeed the investigation has been completed and they are raring to go, and it would be mostly in the interest of justice that this charge gets prosecuted in South Africa. Okay,
sure. So we understand that a task team has been established. Does it include the NPA?
It definitely includes the investigative directorate in the NPA. So the charges from the NPA would be led by Advocate Johnson, and the UAE authorities on their side would then form a team as well, which will interact very closely with our counterparts here, the NPA and ID in particular. And we really think that's a progressive step because where we enjoy very good mutual relations with other countries, we also do see this level of cooperation where the prosecuting authorities are almost able to interact with each other directly. And then when they require formal information, they then submit that through the diplomatic channels. And such levels of cooperation really do trigger results we've seen in other jurisdictions. Dudu, if I may also just quickly update the nation on the Bushiri request. I know that it's also a matter of major interest. You would recall that at around, I think also February, the Malawian court had confirmed that they would like to have witnesses come to Malawi. And they clarified that the witnesses they would like to come to Malawi are South African law enforcement agents who would be able to speak directly to the extradition request. The hearing was supposed to take place on the 30th of April, and our delegation arrived in Malawi ready to authenticate the documents and be witnesses in the Malawian courts. But as we understand it, the fugitives, Mary and Shepherd Bushiri, filed an interlocutory application, basically disputing a new issue in the case. And the court then said, well, we cannot proceed with authenticating the documents. We now have to entertain this new application. So the aspect of the witnesses participating in the matter has been postponed until further notice. We will have to see what the new application will be brought by the Bushiris, so that the Malawian authorities can then dispense with that in their own courts.
Sure. Extraditions are so tricky. Is there any lesson that is coming out of this, and I guess essentially previous cases, right, where you have matters of national interest that are beyond sometimes our jurisdiction? What can we do better? What can be tightened? And the cooperation between different countries on the continent?
Yeah, no, extraditions are tricky as well, because often you would go to countries with different legal systems, completely different legal systems, like in the UAE. It's a completely different legal system. A person would appear immediately at an appeal court, whereas most jurisdictions, what we call common law jurisdictions across the world, you would appear first at a magistrate's court. So it's difficult to preempt what can be tightened and what cannot be. But we are learning some lessons around bilateral agreements, ensuring that we are able to ensure that, for instance, prosecuting authorities interact directly. I think that's something that we would stand as a standard clause in our bilateral agreements moving forward. And we are learning lessons as well. South Africa as well, mind you, do have extradition requests from other countries. And sometimes it takes even 20 years in our own courts, because people nitpick on every aspect of the application, right up until the Constitutional Court. And ultimately then only the Constitutional Court makes a decision after 8, 7, even sometimes 10 years around whether someone is extraditable. So generally the law does allow for this, because people can take up procedural points right up until they've exhausted every procedural point that they can think of. Speaking
of which, the Rwandan refugee who is alleged to have been involved in the genocide in that country that was found in South Africa, where do things stand there?
As we understand it, that's before the courts. The extradition application has been with us for some time now, but we are working closely with the United Nations International Residual Mechanism Tribunal, so that we're able to extradite the Rwandan national to that forum so that he can face the relevant trial. But even then, you know, it took us many, many years to literally just track down this individual and find him within the borders of South Africa. And he was found in a farm somewhere in Paarl as a security guard. Yeah, go figure.
Yeah. Okay. Why do you say go figure?
You know, people that we think should be keeping us safe. And here and behold, someone who has been accused of genocide crimes. So that also speaks to law enforcement agencies, private law enforcement agencies, that they should really vet the people that they employ, because we really need to understand the historical background, whether they have criminal records or whether they are wanted in other countries. We might not know. So I think there's something to be learned there, and that's also something that we will be engaging CIRA on quite closely. So where we do employ people from other nationalities to perform such a function, we really need to be au fait with who they are.
Home affairs as well? How do people get into the country?
Yes, look, we do have a porous borders problem, but sometimes, you know, you wouldn't be able to trigger immediately from Home Affairs whether someone is a wanted person. Ideally, there should be a red notice system that flags such a person. But in this case, we know that this individual was quite meticulous. He obtained a fake passport from Malawi and entered through Swaziland and ultimately. So there was a system in place to really circumvent the migration system. And so those are some of the things that we have to work with as a region as a whole. Yeah. If Swaziland is porous, it means South Africa will be vulnerable. If Malawian systems are porous, it means ultimately South Africa also will be vulnerable. So also looking at the SADC system and ensuring that it's really strong on security features like this is something that we would be wanting our government to take forward quite strongly. Okay, in closing up the conversation, if we can just go back to the Guptas, even when news came out that they were arrested in the UAE, no pictures surfaced of them. Do we know if they're alive? Are they still around? Are we pursuing people who are ultimately alive, I guess, and to the possibility of actually coming back to the country and facing the music? Look, we will be certain on the 15th of June, after the 15th of June meeting, because there will be certain information that is exchanged between the law enforcement agencies, the prosecuting authorities. But like I say, it's a closed system in the UAE. Unlike in South Africa, in the UAE, you can't just walk into a court only if you're a family member of that person. Whereas, you know, in South Africa, anyone can walk into a court, the media is free. In other countries, it's a completely different world. So we have to rely on their integrity. And you would recall that it was actually the Justice Minister in the UAE that released the statement to say that the UAE, the Gupta brothers have been arrested in Dubai by Dubai police and so on. So we would have to rely on their say-so and their integrity.
I can't imagine it's a cheap exercise, Chrispin. Is it still worth pursuing? Does the cost justify the output?
Yes, accountability actually doesn't have a cost. Ultimately, seeing someone being held accountable is an achievement of the rule of law, and whatever it takes, we must never think that it's too expensive to enforce the rule of law under any condition. And we must never think it's too late to enforce the rule of law under any condition, no matter what age the individual is or no matter how long it takes. We must never give up on the rule of law.
Fair enough. Thank you very much to the Department of Justice and Correctional Services spokesperson, Chrispin Phiri.